It's great to welcome you back to another episode of Thinking Through Autonomy. Please keep your comments rolling in about our guests and what you want to hear more about. We recently added an encore episode on automotive cybersecurity based on your feedback. And that's because I want happy listeners to Thinking Through Autonomy. We have 9 more episodes left in this season, and we'll be covering things like AI ethics, financing your startup, facing the shark tank, counter-drone technology, and we'll be featuring a collegiate team that won a nationwide competition on Homeland Security technology that was sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security. Today we're talking with Jim Williams. Jim's been one of the top, if not the top, global regulator on UAS. He ran the FAA's UAS integration office, and if you've ever applied for a waiver, an exemption, or pitched a UTM scheme, you've probably been in his office in Washington, or even have a waiver signed by him. He's in the private sector now, and he talks to us about regulatory perspectives on UAS systems, autonomy and where it fits in government thinking, UTM and what we need to be focusing on, and how we need to think about complying with today's and tomorrow's drone regulations. Welcome to Thinking Through Autonomy, a podcast to help you understand the promise and impact of autonomous land and air vehicles in our world. I'm Ken Dunlap, Managing Partner of Catalyst Go, taking you on this journey. Hear and read more at thinkingthroughautonomy.com. Now it's time to take your hands off the wheel, foot off the pedal, hand off that throttle, and let's go. Jim, welcome to Thinking Through Autonomy.
Good morning. I am so glad to be here.
We are absolutely thrilled that you're here with us, and I just want to dive into the discussion right away.
Okay.
I want to start by talking about this seemingly, and I don't know if I'm characterizing it right, but there seems to be a love-hate relationship between various sectors of the industry and FAA on UAS. And it doesn't seem that we have a middle ground. Is that right? And why do you think that there's this varying sense of feelings coming out, whether you're a small vehicle operator or one of the big vehicle operators, that it's either going great or it's going bad? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I think the biggest source of tension is between the industry who wants to move at the speed of technology and the FAA who is forced to move at the speed of regulation. And that just creates this tremendous tension. The FAA doesn't have a lot of flexibility in how they do rulemaking. It's all written into law by Congress, and it's incredibly onerous. There's been a lot of negative connotation about rulemaking, and it's just been made harder and harder and harder. And a lot of the existing rules for manned aviation just are nonsensical for unmanned aircraft. For example, one of the rules that govern the operation of aircraft state that the flight manual for the aircraft has to be carried on board the aircraft. Well, obviously that's nonsense for an unmanned aircraft because the pilot's on the ground. The whole point of that rule was for the pilot to have access to the flight manual in flight. And when I took over at the FAA, they were forcing companies to get exemptions from that and going through all kinds of machinations around, how do we meet this rule for people flying with that flight manual not on the aircraft. And, I as an executive, you sort of see a bigger picture of things. And so, this was more on the working level that they were doing this. And I went to the person in charge of that, rulemaking, who had the responsibility for that rule. And I says, why don't we just reinterpret this rule to say, what it's meant for is to give the pilot access to the pilot's handbook. So having it with the pilot when they're operating the aircraft is meets the intent of the rule, and that's our interpretation. So we don't have to do this. And he was like, yes, we could do that. And so there was an interpretation, but believe it or not, there was pushback from the legal office on that. So it's that kind of dichotomy that's really holding everything back. And those rules are very difficult to change. It's a 7 to 10 year process to do a major rulemaking project just because of the sheer volume of effort that's required. Every rule has to go through review at the FAA, review at the department, review at the OMB. The OMB sends it out to all interested agencies in the federal government, and with UAS, that's pretty much all of them. They get those comments back. Those comments go back to the DOT, back to the FAA. FAA has to resolve the comments, and then it goes through the same process again when it becomes the final rule. You do it once to say, hey, we were thinking about this rulemaking, and then you have to do it again when you've got all of the comments resolved and after that goes out for public comment. So it's just a laborious process, and the expertise for doing this comes from the same organizations that are doing the day-to-day policy and interpretation of the rules. So it's the same people having to do the rulemaking that have to do the rest of the work. And also understand the FAA has limited the number of people who can do this work by what Congress authorizes them to have. All this new work has come in, and Congress hasn't improved any increase in the staffing at the FAA. So, but on the other hand, you've got the industry saying we must move forward, we must move forward, and especially in the autonomous aspects are really, really tough for the FAA.
Jim, have you seen any other technology issues or airframe or certification issues during your time at the FAA that kind of had the same feel to it, where industry is saying you're not moving fast enough and the FAA says, our job is to keep you safe?
Well, there's been a few, but nothing on this magnitude. This is an order of magnitude more disruptive than anything else, since the jet engine. I mean, when aircraft went from propellers to jets, there was this huge upheaval because of the whole system kind of had to be redone to deal with jet aircraft moving at 2 or 3 times the speed of the prop aircraft. But that was more of an air traffic, kind of operational issues. The one that I lived through more recently was when GPS was introduced. It was this, mysterious military system that people wanted to use in their aircraft, and it was quite disruptive. Now it's accepted as the best navigation system around. And there was a lot of push pull. The industry wanted to take advantage of it. There were real tangible safety benefits for being able to use it, but the rules weren't accommodating, if you will, for
And
for this new technology.
and yet we can't envision a world in which GPS doesn't exist, either in our watches, our airplanes, or our cell phones.
I know. It's crazy. And I think the same thing is going to happen with unmanned aircraft. In 20 years, it'll be like, well, of course my urgent item is delivered by drone. And, that's just the way life is. But right now, we're just going through that transition period where it's, the conservatism of the FAA, and you got to understand, change is risk, and risk is bad for safety. So the whole FAA is all about minimizing risk, and technology is often about risk taking, and so that push pull is always going to be there. I mean, the rulemaking that we did while I was at the FAA for small unmanned aircraft, that rule had been floundering around inside the FAA for a long time because the laws that governed how you approve aircraft in operations were also incompatible. You were required to have an airworthiness approval for all aircraft. And that was just kind of nonsense for your DJI Phantom used by you know, a roofing inspector. So they were struggling with trying to figure out a way forward. And in 2012, Congress passed a law that said, okay, FAA, for small unmanned aircraft, you don't have to do airworthiness. So I was able to completely throw out the old rulemaking that had been struggling for so long and start over again. And we wrote something, well, we wrote basically what you see today in a fairly short period of time. But the only way we were able to do that is that there was this huge push throughout the government to get some sort of rulemaking out there to put some bounds on what was just exploding with the I love the phrase, I don't know who coined it, but that the quadcopter has democratized the aviation industry, because before, to get up in an airplane, to actually fly an airplane, was a very expensive and time consuming process to get a license. Now all of a sudden you can open a box, charge the batteries, and off you go. And that just is such a disruptive thing to aviation that it's really unprecedented.
Let's talk just a little bit about an organization that I know you're familiar with, and that's the UAS Integration Office.
Since I helped start it.
Yes, since that was your idea. One of the things that I just wanted to focus on a little bit, Jim, is that I think there are misconceptions that come out of the name UAS Integration Office because, in reality, it doesn't run the Air Traffic Services Branch. It doesn't
Hmm.
run the ATO, which, as we know, focuses on safety. Yet you have decision makers out of ATS and out of ATO who are responsible for a great many UAS issues. How does this division of responsibilities work? I mean, do you think that the UAS Integration Office has all the horsepower it needs to take these two very, very large and established bureaucracies and get them to respond to the requests that are out there? Or do you see a UAS Integration Office 2.0 that maybe looks a little different and functions a little bit different, over the next 20 years?
Well, when I stood up the office, the idea was that it was going to be a matrixed organization, and I had a branch of air traffic folks, and I had a branch of aviation safety folks, and we worked together to resolve the issues. And that worked when things were getting started, but as time went on, the organizations who are really responsible for making these things happen have to be integrated into the rest of the policy making structure. And so after I left, they reorganized and it kind of went back to a more traditional, aviation safety and air traffic control kind of stood up their own organizations, and those have been growing. I mean, recently the air traffic organization created an executive level. I guess they're a division. I don't know exactly what they call themselves, but under one of my colleagues from when I was there, and they're now responsible for coordinating essentially the same role that I had, but across the air traffic organization. So in that way, it's progress that it's becoming more mainstream within the organizations. And my old organization has given up the regulatory role that I had because we owned the small UAS rule when I was there, but that has been integrated back into the general aviation division, which owns that whole chunk of rules. So they're now coordinators. Jay Merkel, who has well, he didn't replace me, but he replaced the person who replaced me, has responsibilities to coordinate things across the FAA to make sure that everybody's getting stuff done, and it's more of a bully pulpit than a line organization. But one of the things I learned as an executive over 15 years as an executive at the FAA was that positional authority is relatively non-existent in a large bureaucracy, and the only way you get things done is by building a coalition of the willing and getting everybody to work together to go get stuff done. So I think Jay understands that and is trying to work within that structure. What most people also don't understand is Jay is also the coordinator across the federal government and the other agencies to try to work the bigger picture issues, interagency issues. So that's a role that's kind of transparent to the outside, but it's really important inside the government to have everybody lined up. Because remember, I said the rulemaking process it goes through all of the other agencies. Well, if you don't have working relationships with the other agencies when you try to get your rulemaking done, it just it dies in the bureaucracies in those organizations. So it's very critical to keep things coordinated. And so is it perfect? No, it's not, but there is no perfect way forward with something this disruptive.
Well, we've used the word coordination several times, and I got to ask this question. Don't you think that there are times where the leadership over at a UAS integration office is just beating their head against the walls because there's so many other parts of the federal government that are trying to stake a claim in regulating UAS systems, whether it's DHS and the counter UAS systems, whether it's Secret Service and the airspace? What's the secret sauce to making sure that government works together? I mean, do you have to go all the way up to the president and say, let's make sure these cabinet agencies work together, or is there a more nuanced way to do that?
Well, in sometimes it does take intervention at the White House to get things moving. The reason that the Part 107 regulation actually got out in a timely manner was that the national security advisor to the president decided that it was really important to get this done, and he started leaning on the OMB and the other agencies to fast track it and get it done. So if you want something done really really fast, you have to have White House cover, not necessarily the president, but the White House is the boss, and if you get the boss interested in what you're doing, then things happen. The opposite is also true. If the White House doesn't want something you're trying to do to happen, it's dead, dead, dead. So, to a certain extent, moving to the front of the line requires intervention from the White House. But the rulemaking process does work. You can get policy through, but it's difficult and it requires a lot of coordination. And that's why the integration office is still important and relevant, because they can push those kind of things and work the not just the interagency, but the relationship with the department, and coordinate across the bureaucracy at the FAA to make sure things stay, upfront and present. And when I was there, I had a great working relationship with the FAA administrator, and that was just huge to be able to, walk into the administrator's front office, talk to the chief of staff, get a little help moving things forward inside the FAA or even at the department. So and that's why it has to be an executive level job, and it has to have top cover at all levels in order to make the change happen effectively and with at least some nod toward trying to move at the speed of business, not the speed of government.
Let's kind of shift gears just a little bit here and maybe close our discussion on the regulatory aspect of UAS by talking about all of these pilot programs we're seeing, as they are relating to UAS systems, as they're related to UTM. We have, as you know, the IPP, the UPP, Pathfinder, and probably about 3 or 4 other examples as well spread across FAA and NASA. And we hear that there are lessons being learned, but we also are being told that these lessons that are being learned out of all of these programs are used to inform regulation. What does it mean to inform regulation versus publishing a big database of lessons learned?
Well, one of the things you have to understand is that the FAA is exposed to a lot of intellectual property from companies out there who are trying to get things approved, and they have a legal responsibility to protect that. So they're limited in how much they can share when they're working directly with the industry. So a good example of how this works is we knew we had to do something along the lines of authorizing unmanned aircraft to fly in the NAS, but we didn't, and the only tool we had was the law, so we started doing exemptions. And that was the Section 333 exemption process that I stood up that was intended to be sort of a bridge until we could get the rule out and final. And it worked very well. And but it was a tremendous amount of work because the exemption system just wasn't intended to be an approval system. But all of the work we did, all of the learning we had informed that rulemaking, so that like the idea of waivers wasn't in the original rule just because we didn't think about it, but because of the expertise we'd gained dealing with the industry and all the variety of things that they kept inventing and coming up with, we thought, we need to add some flexibility to this rule. And so the folks at the FAA at the time, I'd already left by then, added that whole section on waivers that made Part 107 way more flexible than it could have than it was when we released it for the initial notice of proposed rulemaking. So these lessons learned are excruciatingly important to the FAA because they just don't know. I mean, it's I love my job now because I sit in between this industry and the FAA and almost act like a translator. No, this is where the FAA is coming from. This is why they're doing this. And then on the industry, when I go to the FAA, I say, no, you're not understanding. This is
Yeah.
the industry's motivation. They have to make money on this. This isn't a research program. They can't just keep doing tests all the time. They've got to deliver. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. So these working together projects, all of them, really help educate the FAA on what's really needed, so that it's not what they think is needed, it's what the industry is actually telling them. So they're very, very important to do. How effective are they? Well, that the example I gave was we have waivers in Part 107 that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't done the Section 333 exemption process.
And just to follow up on this, Jim, I've had guests on the show and I've had private conversations where I get the very strong feeling that the Part 107 waiver process is working, that the 44807/333 exemption process is working, and that the authorization process is pretty much working right now. It might be slower than a lot of the organizations were expecting, but in the end, everybody is winding up getting to use the vehicles where they want them to and how they want to employ the vehicles. Yet, we've got people out there that are frustrated there is not a remote ID NPRM on the horizon, and they're frustrated that because that slowed down, there's not going to be a flight over people NPRM. I mean, really, does the NPRM, does that really immediately fix things, or, is that not going to change?
Getting the NPRM out is the first really big step, because then there's a set of congressionally mandated timelines that kind of kick in to keep things moving forward on a somewhat of a level of urgency. So the government is very deliberative on putting out NPRMs, and the rulemaking process, because everybody has to buy in. So one little bit of inside baseball is, if you've seen the flight over people rule, and there was a provision in there which shocked a lot of us, that you can't fly over roads. And I was like, where in the world did that come from? And so I talked to some folks on the FAA and inside the FAA, and they said, well, that was interjected by NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, because they didn't want to increase the risk to the driving public. And I'm like,
Understandable.
right. So,
I have
but
seen drones go up and down the expressway, and that is disconcerting.
it is. And have you seen the I can't remember which Farmers, I think, does the,
Oh,
sort of the
yeah.
museum
Famous
setting
commercial.
with the drone buried in the windshield. Yeah, so, I understand that. But the answer for the drone industry isn't ban flight over roads, because that makes the aircraft basically untenable, but to, have some level of assurance that it's not going to fall down on the cars. I mean, the FAA rule in Part 107 is you can't fly over a moving vehicle. So you can fly over the road, but you can't fly over the road when there's a vehicle present. But the flight over people went backwards on that. But again, that was injected by another agency. So now that's just to give you an idea of the level of complexity of this rule. So the FAA writes it, coordinates it across the FAA, resolves all the comments, sends it to the department. The department looks at it, makes comments, sends it back to the FAA. The FAA works back and forth to resolve all those comments, and then it goes to the OMB. The OMB looks at it, and if they have issues, they send it back to the FAA. If they don't, they send it out to the rest of the federal government for review. Then they collect all of those comments, send it back to the department, back to the FAA. FAA has to resolve all those comments, send it back to the through the department. The department has to agree with the comment resolution. So there's back and forth there. And then the department has to send it back to the OMB. The OMB has to agree with the comment resolution. And then finally, after all this is done, they can go out for comment. And then once the comments come in, you repeat the whole process again, because all of other federal agencies get another look at it before it becomes final. So the process is just incredibly onerous. Plus, there's a lot of congressionally mandated, like you have to do a cost benefit assessment. You have to do an assessment on, environmental impact. You have to do an assessment on impact to small business. You have to do an assessment on, there's one more I'm forgetting, but all of these analyses have to be done on the rule, and then they have to be updated after the comments are done to make sure that none of the changes during comment resolution cause those analyses to be invalidated.
No, no,
It's
wait.
just
Did
nuts.
did we forget the Paperwork Reduction Act as
Oh
well?
yes, that's the one. That's the one I forgot. I knew there was one I was leaving out. Yeah.
Oh, all I could say is, that's a process, and it's making that Part 107 waiver and the 44807 to 333 look a whole lot more enjoyable.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
it's good that we have those, because that's the only thing that's allowing progress right now until some of these things get changed. And there's so many rules. And so like Part 91 has a rule that says that you have to be able to see and avoid other aircraft, right? It's foundational to the way the whole system works. The the word see has legally been determined to mean unaided eyeballs. So if you're so beyond visual line of sight is basically against the rules. Now, fortunately, that happens to be a rule that can be waived, but that means that every operation has to be done under a waiver until such time as that rule is changed to allow an electronic means of compliance, if you will.
No. Well, let's leave regulation behind. How's about that? Because
Sounds good.
this show is called Thinking Through Autonomy, and I want to transition our conversation over to all of this aeronautical magic that we're seeing now.
Hmm.
Your background is engineering and life cycle management, and of course
Hmm.
UAS. And I'm kind of wondering, when you talk about organizations like the FAA and really the industry in general, how should we be differentiating among all of these remarkable technologies that haven't been invented for before, yet have manned applications and have definitely unmanned applications?
Well, the the FAA has dealt with new technologies over and over and over again. So they're used to it. They have a on the aircraft certification side, it's there's a process set up to do it. The certification rules even have a provision in them that said that essentially says if the rules that we've published don't fit your aircraft, you can just propose your own set of rules based on the ones that are out there that are applicable to your type of aircraft. So, for example, blimps. There are no, you won't find blimps in any of the FAA rules. They're not there. So, how do they approve them? Well, they use this provision in the basic certification rules, and there's an industry standard from ASTM on all things blimp, and you have to bring in your demonstration of compliance to that standard, and you get certified this way. So the the new technology isn't really the problem for the FAA until it becomes contrary to the rules. So autonomy is really tough for the FAA because the whole structure of the FAA regulations is about, starts with a pilot in command. So who's the pilot in command of an autonomous aircraft? You can't take if an airman behaves badly, a pilot behaves badly and gets caught, they suspend their license or they revoke their license to fly, thereby pulling that bad actor out of the system. How do you suspend the license of software? You know,
We pull your plug.
right, right,
That's the autonomous system death sentence. And then we'll power you back up when we feel you've served long enough.
exactly. So the one pilot, one aircraft rule was pretty sacrosanct until Intel came along. And I'll never forget the meeting with Krasanich and Huerta when Krasanich came in and pitched this idea of, drone light shows and, controlling 1,000 drones with one person. And, and I was sitting there in the meeting going, geez, that's going to be impossible. And then Michael Huerta, I didn't say it out loud, that's what I was thinking. And then Michael Huerta looks at Christiana and goes, I think we can help you figure out how to do that. And I was like, oh crap, now I got to figure out how to do this. But we did. It took about 2 years, and they started issuing waivers for that. So it's not impossible to deal with autonomy. But it does challenge the FAA, and it does challenge the industry to come up with ways to um, essentially justify the safety of operating without a pilot in direct control. And I think that it's going to happen, and it's going to happen quickly once certain barriers are down. I mean, the FAA is long known that software, you can't test software safety. It's just too complex and too difficult to try to test every possible permutation and combination of what could happen in that software. So they instituted software process assurance. And early in my career, I participated in an update of the standard, and it's been subsequently updated again, so that you use process assurance around the software as it's developed in order to ensure that it's gonna provide repeatable, safe results. But that level of discipline doesn't exist in the Silicon Valley mentality. It's all about quick, rapid changes and beta testing and testing in an operation. And I've for many years I felt like that Microsoft was using us all as beta testers for their operating systems. But that just is the antithesis of FAA certification. It has to be deterministic. It has to be very well controlled, both from a configuration management and quality assurance. And so I think that there's going to have to be some sort of meeting of the ways the automation folks are going to have to take on some discipline, and the FAA is going to have to develop a level of graduated responsibility that kind of meets them halfway. And that I think that's in process, but the way that gets done is through the certification of aircraft. And I think that the industry is starting to step up to the plate on that and push push aircraft through that process. And as that happens more, the standardized ways of doing business are gonna happen, and it'll become more commonplace.
Yeah, and but yet what you described, the processes that we have in place allow an A380 or a Boeing 747 filled with people to auto land in Cat 3A weather and come to a complete stop when there's no visibility anywhere near the runway or the taxiways. So clearly there has to be nuggets within that software certification process that need to get translated back down to these smaller systems, whether it's a smaller drone or whether it's something the size of a Global Hawk, which makes me wonder, Jim, do you think that an industry which really has no experience with that type of certification process, do you think they know how to build their own roadmap to get to that point? Do you think they know how to work with the FAA to build that roadmap? Or do you think a roadmap is not really needed? I mean, because there are people that argue these vehicles are totally different and we don't need that kind of software qualification on our vehicles. Because what's going to happen? It's going to fall out of the sky and the propellers are going to fall off. Big deal.
Right. And for those aircraft, the FAA isn't going to require any sort of certification. The Part 107 doesn't require any level of reliability on the aircraft whatsoever. And everybody's okay with that. Doesn't seem to be causing any kind of issues. People operating under 107, I'm not hearing anything negative about those kind of operations. But the real difference is when you go beyond visual line of sight, the level of safety risk goes up by an order of magnitude, both for risk to people on the ground and risk to other aircraft in the air. Now, smaller aircraft, the risk isn't that high, but it's a lot higher than visual line of sight. Then the bigger aircraft are going to have similar, if not more impact than a small manned aircraft would have for various reasons we don't have to get into. But so what I think the industry has to understand is that the regulations are already graduated from nothing at 107 to an incredible amount of work for a 787. And it's not a linear scale, but it is a scale. And the aircraft certification folks have been preaching risk-based certification for a long time, and are finally, but they have been frustrated at every turn by the bureaucracy. They've been trying to release guidance material on this since 2014 and have been stymied because of the review process. They're trying to put out technical certification policy, and the bureaucracy just kind of chokes on it. And it's the first time they've ever had to do that. The advent of UAS ratcheted up the level of oversight beyond what anybody in the government had ever seen before. So when I was working in an aircraft certification 20 years ago, the FAA could publish advisory circulars pretty much at will, and because they're just advisory, they don't have any regulatory status. They're just a means, but not the only means of complying with the rules. And that we published them regularly. It was pretty easy. The first job I had in headquarters, that was our main product. With avionics standards branch, we published technical standard orders and advisory circulars. We had a couple of rulemakings, but mostly it was those kind of technical policy documents, and they never went outside of the FAA. Now they have to go through the department and through the OMB just like rules do. And we've talked about how difficult the rulemaking process is, but if you actually go and talk to the certification folks and open up a certification project, they give you all of this information that they haven't been able to release publicly so that you can use it on your project.
Keeping our focus just a little bit more on private industry because that's where you and I work 24/7 and on the
Right.
private side. One of the observations that I've made over the last couple of years is that we have companies that are caught messaging and promoting technology based on finding the next round of investor. And yet, when this kind of hype comes to the regulators, instead of really the reality of what they're trying to accomplish, it seems to make the regulatory job even more difficult. Do you think that there's a way that we can get the industry to adopt some more common of a language, more reality in what they're trying to pitch, and say, hold your investment pitches for somebody else. Let's talk technology to the regulators, because when you confuse the two, you're not going to be happy with the result.
Yeah, and frankly, that's part of what I do in my consultancy is to educate the industry on what the FAA wants to hear about. A lot of times I've had clients who go, "Hey, we want to go tell the FAA about all this." I'm like, "Okay, why?" "Well, it's really great technology, and we know they're going to like it, and they're gonna want us to do it." And I'm like, "But what are you gonna ask them for?" "Well, nothing right now. We're really not ready to do certification." And I'm like, "Then you're just wasting their time and yours." I said, "Unless you're going to the FAA to ask for an approval of some sort, you don't need to go talk to them. It's just a waste of your time." And I said, when you're ready to go ask for an approval, a waiver, a certification, or whatever, then we'll put together a package, explain to them what we're asking, and you can be successful. So it's just there is a vast level of misunderstanding about what the FAA does, what their role is, what their authority is, etc., which I'm kind of glad for because that's what enables me to be in the business that I'm in, which is essentially helping people to understand and effectively use that system to get their projects, programs, aircraft, whatever approved to go fly in the National Airspace System.
Which brings us back to a question I've always have been struggling with when it comes to autonomy. We know that there are various levels of autonomy, kind of like AI. AI is a generic branding for anything involving machine learning, and autonomy is the generic branding in the aviation industry for any vehicle that moves by itself, seemingly. And the two types of autonomy that we see, we have, the typical, we'll put out GPS breadcrumbs and we'll follow those breadcrumbs, and therefore we have an autonomous vehicle. We've got vehicles, other types of vehicles that have perception systems in them. So whether they're LiDAR based or whether they're visual based, that's how they navigate. How do you advise your clients to put their arms around autonomy when they're talking to regulators about the specifics of how that vehicle navigates? Do you get them off of the less precise language and say, okay, you got to use GPS, you have to use that language? Or where does it fall? Where does it fall, Jim? What do you tell them to talk about?
So the first thing I tell them is don't ever say you have an autonomous aircraft
Why is that?
because ICAO has a set of standards for what that means. And unmanned aircraft systems are divided into two categories, remotely piloted and autonomous. And autonomous is defined as an aircraft operating without the possibility of intervention from a pilot on the ground. Whereas remotely piloted is that there's a pilot in command of that can affect the flight. So even though a global hawk could take off and fly its whole mission and land without anybody ever touching it, it's not autonomous because there is always a pilot in command who's communicating with that aircraft who can change its trajectory, alter its mission, even though they don't have to. So when the FAA hears autonomous, they mean that to them says, well, you can't operate because you have to have a pilot in command, A, by regulation, but B, if you're interacting with air traffic control, how are you going to react to air traffic control instructions? The aircraft, unless the aircraft has sophisticated voice recognition technology so they could respond as a pilot would to air traffic control instructions, you're not going to be allowed to operate. So highly automated is what I tell them to say, and FAA is okay with that. I mean, just like you said earlier, most modern air carrier aircraft have the ability to do what's called a Category 3C auto land, which is where the pilots don't have to touch anything until they're ready to taxi off the runway. So the FAA is quite comfortable with autonomy, but autonomous is a dirty word to them. So understanding the language and understanding that, yeah, you want the aircraft to navigate itself, no problem. You want the aircraft to automatically avoid obstructions in other aircraft. Well, that's a little bit more of a challenge, but it's doable. Just like the Airbus is putting automatic TCAS maneuvers in their aircraft, so that if a TCAS maneuver is warranted and the pilot doesn't initiate it, the autopilot will take over. But the pilot still has the ability to override that if they think it's not safe. And I think that's kind of a foundational issue that I try to get across to my clients who want to do highly automated operations, understanding the regulatory structure that you got to fit in. And I haven't yet talked to anybody who really had a truly autonomous aircraft.
Let's talk a little bit now about pilot licensing, because I think it kind of flows from that.
Hmm.
Given the fact that there will, for the foreseeable future, be a pilot in command over these autonomous vehicles, but I have to be careful how I use that. Right now, as you know, we see just really one level of remote pilot and command license. It's under Part 107. And yet, if you look at the analog, which are the types of licenses available for, I'll call it manned aviation, you've got private pilot licenses, and the routine. You've got commercial pilot licenses, multi-engine, airline transport pilot licenses, and they seem to vary with the complexity of the operation. So if you got something really complex where you're flying a lot of people around, of course, you need to have that ATP, the air transport pilot license. And if it's just yourself that's putting the world in danger in a small Cessna, well, we'll give you a private pilot's license. Do you envision the day where UAS systems are going to have varying levels of pilot licensure? And what should that level of licensure be tracked against? Is it the complexity of the vehicle or what? What do you think?
Well, I think it's going to have more to do with where you're going to operate. If you're going to go operate in a terminal environment, for example, and you're going to have to interact with air traffic control and remotely pilot your aircraft in response to air traffic control communications, you're going to need to know a lot more than a 107 pilot certificate. On the other hand, is it the same as a private pilot? Well, no, because a lot of the private pilot requirements are about hours of operation, stick and rudder skills, things that aren't really applicable to operating an unmanned aircraft. So yeah, I think that eventually you will see the pilot regulations creating new types of certificate for unmanned pilots as time goes on. But it's not super critical because you can get a private pilot's license or even a light sport pilot's license fairly easily, and so the restrictions aren't a barrier, if you will, to operations.
Yeah, well, for my part, I just can't. And look, I'm biased. The listeners know that my background is as a commercial pilot, and I'm just biased, to the thought that maybe the most complex system that involves the most risk, that involves, really the highest level of safety you need are the quote unquote autonomous systems where you push a button and let it go fly its pre-programmed mission making navigation decisions on its own. And maybe, that's where the Uber remote pilot certificate, needs to be placed. But, again, I have a bias in all of this. Jim, let's transition and talk just a little bit about vehicle safety. And I guess this may extend to the safety of the corporations that are operating these vehicles. What capabilities do you think that a company or an operator needs to possess so that they can convince the FAA that they're going to be a sensible operator, that they're going to be a good custodian of this technology, and they're not going to hurt people with it?
Well, let's break that down into two pieces. So there's the safety that comes from the vehicle that's being operated, the unmanned aircraft, and then there's the safety from the operator themselves. The vehicle, I think the biggest thing that most of the companies on the vehicle side don't really get is that a lot of your approval from the FAA comes in your demonstrated reliability of that aircraft. If you're continually making changes to the aircraft, you never really get an opportunity to demonstrate any sort of level of reliability to it. So if you don't know what changes are taking place and you don't have any control about how those changes are made, you basically build no credibility for the reliability of your aircraft. So the sort of the foundation that a lot of the aircraft manufacturers need to build on is good solid configuration management, quality assurance. Those are kind of the foundation of any aircraft that the FAA is going to approve. On the operator side, it's similar in that your level of trust from the FAA is based on your demonstrated history of compliance with the rules and safe operations. So if you look at an airline, for example, the airlines have a tremendous amount of delegated responsibility from the FAA. I mean, they can do all kinds of approvals on their own for maintenance that if you're an individual and you own your aircraft, you have to pay people to do this stuff for you. But the airlines all can train their own pilots, they can train their own mechanics, they have the ability to make changes to their aircraft within limits. And all of these are essentially delegated authorities from the FAA, and a lot of that is based on their history. So it's very difficult to get an air carrier certificate because you have to show the FAA that you have all of these systems in place and that you've got the ability to, maintain the aircraft, train the pilots, etc. If you want to have that, same level of trust from the FAA, you're going to have to build a similar level of structure around your operations. You're going to have to keep track of the maintenance of your aircraft, keep track of the configurations of your aircraft. You're going to have to keep track of your pilots. How many hours do they have? What kind of training have they have? Even though the FAA doesn't require any practical training for a 107 license, there's a lot of third-party training available that basically helps you reduce your risk of operations. So the more you make your operation look like a commercial manned aircraft operation, the more the FAA is going to trust you, the more they're going to, take your word for things as opposed to going in and verifying and looking at everything down to the lowest level.
Which makes me wonder, Jim, if there's an organization called Honest Ken and Honest Jim's drone manufacturing company, do we get placed at a disadvantage if we're being compared against the same kind of standards that, say, a General Atomics or a Boeing or fill in the blank are holding themselves to because they have more infrastructure, they've got more money? I mean, are we locking the entry level businesses out of the process by doing that?
No, because the FAA has dealt with, sort of entry level aircraft for a very long time. The whole concept of light sport aircraft, even, Part 107 is built on the same logic as Part 103 for ultralights. Ultralights don't have to be certified. They're not considered aircraft. They're considered vehicles. And the FAA did that because all aircraft are required to have an airworthiness certificate until 2012. So you can have an aircraft, takeoff weight with passenger up to 350 pounds, and it's not, and people ride in them, and there's no certification on it. And so companies are out there building them. They build them to the good ones, build them to standards, ASTM standards for construction so that people don't get killed in them. But there's no FAA certification around them. So there's this graduated level of interaction with the FAA. Light sport aircraft, you don't you can issue airworthiness certificates without having to have a design approval if you follow the ASTM standards for light sport aircraft and you certify to the FAA that you're building to them. So there is a way forward for Joe UAS manufacturer to get into the system and become part of the approved aircraft methodology. Now, granted, the FAA hasn't made it easy because there's no how-to guides out there like there is for, but they're coming. The ASTM standards are maturing rapidly, and the FAA is in the process of putting together a set of guidelines that'll allow self-certification within certain bounds based on demonstrated reliability and performance. So I think that's coming. That everybody isn't being held to the Boeing standard.
And that kind of gives me hope for Honest Jim and Ken's drone company. So um, I just want to end the show with just a question or two about UTM, because that seems to be where we're seeing a lot of effort being expended by a lot of big companies. And let's talk about how autonomy either helps or hurts the mission of UTM or the job of UTM. My proposition is, I think these UTM systems are great, but if autonomy allows one pilot to operate 300 vehicles, all we've done is create a system that will have a very high probability of being overwhelmed. Do you see issues with there being too much autonomy? And do you see there being issues with too many promises for UTM about trying to keep these vehicles separate, where maybe we're going to wind up in a situation where we just have too many vehicles to control and no single UTM solution is going to be able to control all those vehicles?
Well, the thing that worries me about UTM is it seems to be everything to everybody, but yet show me the UTM standard that tells me what it really is. I mean, right now UTM is a research program out of NASA designed to try to provide some level of organization to uncontrolled airspace. And it's going through its fourth flight testing. This is the most sophisticated one, and out of that hopefully will come some information that can get transferred to the FAA. But unless the FAA picks it up and says, okay, yeah, we think this will work, we're gonna endorse a standard way of doing it, it's really just a research program. And so I'm concerned that too many people are putting too much faith in something right now that's very researchy and isn't real from the standpoint of, can I use this UTM thing to enable my operations? I think both Amazon and Google think that they know exactly what it is, and they're gonna put it into place when they start doing deliveries. But those are systems designed by them for them. Are they really going to be compatible with anybody else? And what level of delegated authority is the FAA going to give to those UTM service suppliers? It's still, to me, there's a lot of uncertainty in UTM. It has a lot of promise. Don't get me wrong. I'm not bad mouthing it. And I think it is an enabler to doing low-level operations with lots of aircraft. But there's still a lot of unanswered questions about how you deal with non-participants, how you deal with interfacing, how you deal with the fairness of, if there becomes a limit to access, who gets to decide who gets in and who doesn't. So there's still a lot of uncertainty there, and hopefully the results of the ongoing, they're currently ongoing with NASA's fourth go around, and the one that's closest to what I would call real world testing is going on now. And then the real question mark is what does the FAA do with this? Because NASA can only take it so far. FAA's got to take it from there and turn it into something real and usable.
Well, Jim, you just had the last word, and thank you so much for being on Thinking Through Autonomy. This has just been fantastic. I want to thank you for your contributions to driving this revolution and for getting the industry and the government off to a great start through your time at the FAA. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.